sort of related to that, since the center has, opened, because sometimes within struggles, people who are allies, maybe once that kind of institutional framework was created, maybe sort of step back or sort of decline in sort of their roles as allies. Mm-hmm. What has been the case at Grand Valley? Have you seen kind of a steady, or has it been
I think Allies and Advocates continues. I think they are doing still 3 trainings a year. I know the Greek organizations approached the Resource Center about some training for allies, and they've trained a significant number of Greek members, which is pretty phenomenal, and they become truly advocates, I think. So no, I wouldn't say there's been a diminishing effect. I think the Allies organization is still fairly large, and there's a lot of support for the center and the work that it's doing, and the work that it's doing is just really astounding to me when I see all the programming that they're doing and all that they have available. I honestly think that the atmosphere that we create at Grand Valley, even though there are people who are still critical of the fact that we're not quite as multicultural accepting as we could be, I think the atmosphere that we create for many actually saves some lives. Given that they have a support structure and a place to go and people to talk to, I hope that is true, that it's saving lives and helping people become who they need to be.
I was thinking about particularly your role at the bookstore, which is fun because I'm also a big reader of books. I wonder if it just, because you would probably know better than anybody in terms of like the types of texts that are being used, mm-hmm. What changes have you seen that would reflect maybe this sort of evolution, this growing awareness, and acceptance? I mean, is it reflected in the kind of literature that's being used in the classroom?
Well, there are certainly some classes for which I think that Milt has taught the Life Journey course and has used a number of LGBT titles for that. I think other faculty I've talked to, Wendy Winter has. I know there are a number of courses taught through Women and Gender Studies that use LGBT literature. I've had the complaint from some that a lot of that literature is just so full of sexuality that it's hard to find something that appeals to a broad range of people. It's interesting as you said that. What flashed back to me was the fact that there was a faculty member at Aquinas College back in the 70s who was using things like the front and runner and was having people actively, walking out of class or slamming the books down. Books that were pretty remarkable for the time to be using in those courses. So I think, it's probably become more accepting to include that in the coursework than it has been in the past. But it's not commonplace, I guess. It would be in the Women and Gender Studies section that those are mostly used, I think.
So you've been at Grand Valley for a quarter of a century.
Mm-hmm.
Were you from the area?
I born and raised in Grand Rapids, never got very far, unfortunately.
So what's your sense of, in relationship to Grand Rapids then, in terms of this evolution? We've been talking about this evolution around LGBT issues on campus. How would you compare that to Grand Rapids or greater Grand Rapids area? Is Grand Valley, seem to be on par with what's been happening here? Are they ahead of the curve? How do you sort of gauge that in terms of the larger sort of metropolitan area?
I think that Grand Valley is a leader in the area. I think there are other organizations that I know have very good human rights organization scores. It seems to me that Herman Miller might be one of those. I think Grand Rapids is not unlike Grand Valley. It's kind of a, Grand Valley reflects Grand Rapids in that, for me, I've felt very comfortable being out. I'm in a neighborhood where people are very supportive. My partner and I live among people, who just treat us. We're just part of the neighborhood, and maybe I've isolated myself with supportive people. I don't know, but I have a sense that there are pockets of Grand Rapids that are just very comfortable places to be. And I think that's true in the arts. I think, people find a way to make a niche in this community. And I feel that pretty much, yeah, it's conservative, but that doesn't affect me, sort of. And I think the same is true at Grand Valley. There are people I know who don't support LGBT issues. The faculty is not universally supportive. In fact, I've had some pretty strong conversations with some faculty who are not supportive. But by and large, if you find a network of people who support you and you talk loud enough, that sort of becomes the reality eventually. I think we teach people how to treat us. And I certainly, as the manager of an organization with, 100 employees, I demand respect of everybody. We had a student who was exploring her sexuality and did a transgender transition over the course of a year. And it was fascinating because she was so convincing as a woman that there were guys who were eyeing her all the time and didn't realize that she was trans. But it was amazing to watch a staff of 100 people, some of whom were not accepting at the beginning, because this person was so comfortable with herself that became extraordinarily accepting of her by the end. I mean, it was who she was meant to be. And so that it just became natural for people to accept her.
Well, considering that, there's been a tremendous kind of growth and evolution on campus that you've seen and that you've been a part of, how important is it, do you think, for kind of current students and then future students at campus to kind of have at least a sense of that history? And how important is it to understand and sort of appreciate what people have done to kind of get to where we are now?
I think it's important, it's valuable. I think it's difficult. I think on Martin Luther King Day, and we might be out marching, and there are so many students who aren't marching or who don't understand the importance and who sort of say, oh, well, that was a long time ago, and that doesn't affect me. And I think that's the nature of youth, not to understand what's come before. I think initiatives like this are important for that reason, so that we have some sense of that history, that it just hasn't always been this way. So we will get, 20 or 30 or 50 years down the road in Michigan, and gay civil unions will be fully accepted, or gay marriages, and people will say, well, it's silly, why were we ever there? But it is important to have that history, because there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that happens over the process, and people are not always treated fairly or humanely to get to that point. A lot of people struggle and suffer until those rights come about.
Well, listening, to you talk about what's been going on, in particular the stories you told about how with your staff, your employees at the bookstore, and how some of that have been changed because of other staff who identify as the LGBT community. And what advice would you have for the next upcoming generation about what's important? What do you think are important things to think about in terms of what advice you would offer them about maybe on sort of a positive note about what the future holds for them in terms of possibilities, considering those changes over the last 2 or 3 decades?
I think it's important to hold fast to one's beliefs and to demand respect and to demand equality. There's a fight that has to go on, but there also has to be a sort of equanimity, I think, about that fight. I don't think we can become so frustrated and so tied up in knots about what is going to evolve eventually. It's not to say we give up, and it's not to say that's all we do is fight for our rights, but that we, a little like Milt Ford, the water against the rock, seems to effect change sometimes more quickly and more gracefully than screaming out loud. I think there's a place for screaming too, but sometimes that sitting down with people and having conversations, I think people telling their stories In this age of Facebook, where everything is very instant and soundbite, I think it's important for people to sit and listen to each other's stories and to learn from them, because we all have so far to go in terms of really understanding different cultures, different communities. I think it's just critical to listen to people and hear where they've come from and what they've done, and then to formulate our own ideas about where we're going and whom we want to become. So.
I don't have any other specific questions you think we've kind of covered? So there are aspects of the history you think we need to?
No, I
expand
think we pretty much covered it.
on? Great. I appreciate you coming in and talking to us.
You bet. Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah.